Hi everyone! I hope you're all having a great week. This week I've decided that I want to work on a super simple but very colorful abstract sunrise. I want to keep the process as simple as possible so that I can keep it very mindful and at the same time practice some skills, watercolor skills in particular, that don't necessarily require a lot of thought, but just need a little bit of experimentation in order to get used to using them. All the colors and tools I'll be using to make this little painting will be listed in my video description down below. Please take note that I usually do make a list of all those products that I use in my video description, but if you ever have any questions about any specific products, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I started my process by applying 4 different colors, and I'm using what's called a wet on wet technique, which means that I'm not letting any of the colors dry before I apply the second color. And by doing so, the colors will blend into each other. Just on a little side note, a few people had asked me when the new Pull Pen Paint season would begin, and I'm happy to announce that I will be teaching in Pull Pen Paint again this year, and we will be starting our new Pull Pen Paint season very shortly. If you'd love to register, or if you'd love to get more information about Pull Pen Paint, please go down to my video description below where you'll find a link to get more information. Once I was done applying my first colors, I cleaned up my brush and came back in over the painting and just swept my brush across the entire surface. And I did this because I wanted to blend the colors into each other. Then, while the paint and the surface of my paper were still wet, I came in with some fine-grained table salt and I added some to the bottom portion of my painting. Once I was done applying the salt to my surface, it was then time to let the surface dry completely before moving on to the next layer. I really like the textures that were created on the bottom portion of my painting, but at the very top, I felt like the color looked a little bit green, and that wasn't really the look I was going for. So I came in with a wet, clean brush, and I wet the surface of the paper, and then I took some paper towel and dabbed the paper towel over the paint to lift some of that color from the paper. It's not going to lift all of the color, but it will lift some of it. And then I'm going to come back in and add another bit of Carmine Naccarat just to change the look of that top portion of the painting. I don't want that area of the painting to be green because I intend for it to be my sky, if you will, my abstract sky. So we're talking about developing a sunrise here, and the colors in my sunrise, I want them to be more yellow and have a little bit of that Carmine Naccarat, but I want to avoid making it green. So that's why I decided I wanted to lift some of that paint, and then once I come back in with the Carmine Naccarat, it'll also make the yellow underneath look a little bit more orange, and that's more the look that I'm going for. I really want to keep today's process as simple as possible, and I like to do little painting processes like this every once in a while for myself because it's good for me to practice different techniques, but I also want to be able to offer those of you out there who don't have a lot of experience using watercolors also to have a chance to practice some of those techniques. And while you're in this learning process, I also hope to offer you the advice to try and be compassionate with yourself. Anytime we try to do something new, it can be a bit challenging at first, but over time, the more we practice things, the easier they get. For this second layer of color in the painting, the intention is really to intensify the pigment that's already on the paper. And so I'm coming in with a little bit more pigment, but I'm not using so much pigment that it will completely cover what's already on the paper. I do love those textures that were created by the salt, so I don't want to cover them up completely. But I want to add a little bit more color pigment, so I am doing so in a very intentional way. And as I'm adding the colors, I feel like it's really brightening up my background. And I love that. So I feel like at this point, all I really needed to add were these 2 layers of color, and then I'm going to move on to starting to work with my pens. After letting my background dry completely, I came in with my black fountain pen and I started to add some lines in my painting, and this is going to be representative of my landscape. It's an abstract landscape, and all I'm doing is simply following some of the shapes that were created by the salt and the paint in the background of my painting, and I'm creating some irregular lines. For me, this is going to represent different layers of elements in my abstract landscape. It could be bushes, it could be grass. It's nothing realistic, it's just a way of doing an abstract representation of a landscape. And because I'm trying to keep it more abstract, it's also going to release me from the pressure of having to create something realistic, which sometimes can be a little bit more daunting and a little bit more challenging. And sometimes when we take on challenges that maybe we're either not ready to take on or we're not feeling up to taking on, especially on a specific day if we're not feeling well, then it creates a little bit more stress and a little more pressure. And the point of this painting process is really to keep things as simple as possible so that we can learn, we can practice different skills, but have fun as we're doing it, and also use it a bit like therapy, if you will. When a process is very mindful and uncomplicated, it can also be very therapeutic, it can be very relaxing and very enjoyable. And it's good to have these moments of creative practice where we're not being hard on ourselves, we're just playing, we're just having fun. And in doing so, we learn a lot. And so I think it's important to have these creative, playful moments. One way to sort of ensure that my process is super simple, relaxing, and mindful is to just keep the marks that I'm making on my paper as easy as possible. So making vertical lines That was not difficult. And I chose not to use my ruler to make all of my vertical lines because I wanted to keep them organic looking. And I find that they look more interesting this way. But using my ruler as a guide to create a few lines helped me to create lines that weren't necessarily completely straight, but were sort of parallel, even though they were a little bit irregular. So that's just a little bit of a tip or a trick that you can use to help keep your lines more parallel when you're working. But really, experiment and try to do things in a way that feels right for you. So vertical lines are definitely a way that I like to use my mark making. I love to create vertical lines, but I also, as I've mentioned in many of my videos, love to use stippling. And stippling is what I'm doing right now. And it's just a process of adding little dots of ink. And the more I add, the thicker the appearance of the dots is, and then that helps to create a little bit of dimension in the painting. So I like to add some stippling here and there. I love to add it because I really love the effect of it, but I also love stippling because it's so easy and it's so simple. There really is nothing complicated about stippling, and it's such a mindful practice because it's really easy to do this process and to just focus on what it is that I'm doing. And I find it so relaxing that I feel like time just kind of goes by so quickly when I'm doing this. Anyway, I really enjoy it, and I hope that this is something that you can embrace as well. However, if for whatever reason stippling just isn't your thing, listen to yourself and maybe find those marks that are more meaningful to you and use those marks in your work. Another way to keep things as simple as possible is to use tools that can make certain processes simpler, such as this compass. I, especially when it comes to drawing circles, love to use either circle guides, or this compass actually works quite well. The one thing I will remind you, however, to do is to make sure that if you are drawing a number of different circles or arcs the way I'm doing right now, is to make sure that you leave the tip of your compass down on the paper rather than lifting it up in between each line, because you will stay with circles that are on the same center if you keep your tip down. If you lift it up, there's a chance you might actually lose that center. Here I'm just using a moldable eraser to lift a little bit of the pencil marks that are down on the paper. I'm going to be applying gold paint on top of those pencil marks, and so they will be covered, but I want to make sure that they're not too dark so that they don't show. When I'm tracing over lines that I have just applied, I tend to use a very light touch with my brush. So I don't press very hard on my bristles, which would tend to make the line thicker. And in this case, especially with this line right here, I just really want to have a thin line covering the line that's underneath. And so I'm applying a very light touch, and I'm only touching the very tip of my brush to the paper. Doing so more slowly tends to be easier than if I try to rush things. Similar to the lines I added for my rising sun, where I was using a very light touch with my brush, I'm also using a very light touch here, just gently touching the tip of my brush on the paper as I'm applying the dots. The gold does add an element of light value contrast in my painting. Still, I'm going to come in with my white fountain pen and add a little bit of stippling around the arcs in my rising sun, just to add a little bit more of that value contrast. I also feel that the arcs in my sun could use a little bit more value contrast. And so I'm going to come in with my black fountain pen and add a little bit of stippling, just a tiny amount, a very light stippling around the arcs. And this will help to define those arcs just a little bit more. And that's it. Like I said, I wanted to keep this painting ultra simple to make sure that I could stay mindful, practice a few different little skills, just have fun. To keep things simple and easy doesn't mean the painting will be any less beautiful. And I really love how this little painting turned out. I hope this simple little painting project will get you motivated to paint too. Thank you so much for making the time to join me on this journey. I hope you have a wonderful week and happy creating!